Have you ever wondered what true silence sounds like? Not the peaceful kind of silence that comes with a quiet evening, but the heavy, suffocating silence that arrives when a long-standing illusion finally shatters. Most people live their lives afraid of that moment. They walk on eggshells, pretending the cracks in their foundations aren't growing wider. They are terrified of what they might find if they look too closely, or if they decide to show up where they aren't expected. I, however, have never been one of those people. For me, silence is not a sign of peace. It is a sign of data. It is a blank page waiting for the truth to be written upon it. It was a Tuesday, exactly 2:15 p.m., when I stood in the mudroom of my private cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air in the mountains is usually crisp and clean, but that afternoon, it felt stagnant. I hadn't planned to be there, and that was the primary reason the afternoon unfolded exactly as it did. My daughter-in-law, Sarah, was supposed to be in Chicago at a high-level marketing conference. My son, Mark, was at his desk, working on code for a firm he had helped build from the ground up. The cabin was supposed to be empty, a place of solitude for me to review some lingering estate documents and enjoy the view. When I pushed the heavy oak door open, the wood groaned just a little, a sound that seemed to slice through the stillness of the house. I didn't announce my arrival. I didn't shout a greeting. I walked into the living room with the quiet precision of a man who knows that timing is everything. And there they were. The scene was almost cliché in its execution. Sarah, my son's wife, was standing by the fireplace, and the man beside her was someone I recognized immediately from the business journals I often read. It was Sterling, the CEO of the firm that managed Sarah's marketing account. The shock didn't hit them immediately. In those first few seconds, there was a strange, paralyzed confusion. They didn't scream. They didn't bolt. They just froze. It was as if the reality of my presence had stripped away their ability to process anything else. I stood there, looking at them, not with the anger most fathers-in-law might feel, but with the cool, analytical detachment that has defined my entire life. I checked my watch. 2:16 p.m. I wasn't looking for a confrontation that involved yelling. I was simply observing. I looked at the way they were standing, the way Sterling's hand had frozen mid-gesture, and the way the blood drained from Sarah's face. She didn't look guilty in the way a child looks guilty when they've stolen a cookie. She looked small. She looked like a liability in an otherwise well-managed portfolio. People often ask me why I didn't explode with rage. They expect a father to protect his son's honor with fire and fury. But you see, I am not a man of emotion. I am a retired forensic accountant and crisis management consultant. My entire career was built on the foundation of auditing corporate wreckage, navigating the complexities of high-stakes fraud, and dismantling the elaborate lies that white-collar criminals build around themselves. I spent 40 years looking at ledgers, contracts, and internal communications, searching for the single discrepancy that proves the entire structure is built on a foundation of sand. When you spend your life finding errors in balance sheets, you learn very quickly that screaming at the numbers doesn't fix the math. My son Mark is a good man. He is a brilliant software engineer, but he possesses a fatal flaw. He is a man of faith in human nature. He trusts, because he assumes everyone else operates with the same integrity that he does. He built this cabin as a sanctuary for his family, believing that the thick mountain air and the isolation would provide the perfect environment for a happy life with Sarah. He never looked at the ledger. He never looked for the anomalies. But I did. My mind is wired to spot deviations. When a date on an expense report doesn't align with a conference schedule, or when a person's behavior starts showing a variance from their established baseline, I don't get angry. I get curious. I have spent decades dealing with people like Sterling, men who think that because they have reached the top of a corporate ladder, they are immune to the laws of cause and effect. Men who believe that their status, their money, and their charm provide them with a shield against the consequences of their actions. They are the easiest kind of targets because they are arrogant. And arrogance, in my experience, is the most common cause of professional suicide. They leave trails everywhere they go. They think they are being clever, but they are only being predictable. I stood there in that living room, watching the two of them realize that their secret, their carefully constructed reality, had just been audited by the one person they never expected to show up. I wasn't there to destroy them, not yet. I was there to confirm the data. I was there to ensure that the error I had detected in the system was indeed what I thought it was. It wasn't about revenge. Revenge is a messy, emotional, and ultimately inefficient endeavor. I was interested in correction. I was interested in justice. And as I looked at the two of them, trembling in the middle of a house that belonged to my son, I knew exactly how this audit was going to end. The human mind is a master of compartmentalization. We have a remarkable ability to ignore the things we don't want to see, especially when those things are sitting right in front of us. My son, Mark, was living in a home built on a shifting foundation, and he was completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was liquefying. I, however, have spent my life training myself to ignore the narrative people feed me and focus entirely on the data points. And in the months leading up to that afternoon in the cabin, the data was screaming. It began with something as simple as a piece of jewelry. I was at their house for dinner a few months back, and Sarah was wearing a new Cartier bracelet. Now I understand that people have different spending habits, and I don't begrudge anyone a nice accessory. But I know their household budget. I know what they make, what they save, and what they spend on the mortgage. A piece like that didn't fit the line item. When I complimented her on it, she laughed and said it was a bonus from work. It was a throwaway line, meant to end the conversation. To Mark, it was a closed chapter. To me, it was a red flag. In my line of work, you learn that people rarely account for sudden infusions of capital. When they do, they get defensive. That small bracelet was the first thread. I didn't pull at it right away. That's the mistake amateurs make. If you pull too hard, the seam rips, and the person covers their tracks. You have to let them keep sewing. I waited. I watched. I listened. The pattern started to emerge with her business trips. Sarah worked in marketing, a role that often required travel, but the schedule was erratic. She was constantly flying to Chicago, or New York or Boston, for regional synergy meetings. I recall one specific instance where she claimed to be in Chicago for a 3-day summit. I happened to be reading an industry trade journal that week, and I noticed that the major marketing summit for that sector was being held in Dallas, not Chicago. It was a minor detail, the kind of thing a spouse would never check, but it was an error in the ledger. It was a date that didn't match the transaction. I started keeping a mental log of these anomalies. There were others. The way she would leave the room to take a phone call, her voice dropping to a low, hushed tone that disappeared the moment she saw me walk around the corner. The way she started dressing with more effort when she was working from home than she ever did for her marriage. And then there was the smell. It's a small sensory detail, but it speaks volumes. I borrowed her car once to run an errand, and as I sat in the driver's seat, I caught the faint, lingering scent of a specific, expensive cologne. It was heavy, woody, and unmistakably masculine, sandalwood and cedar. Mark didn't wear cologne. He barely even used aftershave. I sat there in the car for a moment, letting the smell register. I didn't get angry. I didn't feel the urge to confront her right then and there. I simply cataloged the information. It was another data point that conflicted with the story being told. The most difficult part of watching this unfold wasn't the betrayal itself. It was watching what it did to Mark. Sarah was a master of the secondary narrative. When Mark would ask a simple question about her trip or her late nights, she wouldn't just answer, she would turn the question back on him. She would frame his curiosity as insecurity. She would accuse him of not trusting her, of being controlling, of being the reason for their struggling marriage. It was a classic deflection. She was gaslighting him, making him feel guilty for noticing the cracks she was creating. I watched my son, a man who built secure systems for financial institutions, lose his own sense of security in his home. He started apologizing for asking about her day. He started taking on extra work to make up for the tension in the house. He was paying for her betrayal with his own peace of mind. He was trying to fix a relationship that was already being liquidated by the person he trusted most. I spent those weeks in a state of quiet, detached observation. I didn't say a word to Mark. Telling him prematurely would have been useless. He wouldn't have believed me. Not because he was naive, but because he loved her. To him, the truth was an impossibility. I had to wait until the evidence was undeniable. I had to wait until the ledger was balanced. Every time Sarah walked through the door, I looked at her and saw the lies. I saw the inconsistencies in her story. I saw the way she looked at her phone with that faint, satisfied smile before quickly locking the screen. She thought she was being careful. She thought she was being smart. But in my experience, everyone thinks they are the exception to the rule. They think that because they have covered their tracks well enough to fool their spouse, they have covered them well enough to fool the world. They forget that there is always someone watching. They forget that for every action, there is a reaction, and eventually, the audit comes for everyone. I knew that the next step was to move from observation to investigation. I didn't need to snoop through her private messages or hack her email. I needed something far more professional. I needed to let them lead me to the final proof. I needed to see just how deep this fraud went, and I needed to be ready to document every single step of it. Most people, when they suspect a betrayal, immediately jump to the amateur tactics. They try to guess passwords, they snoop through text messages while their partner is in the shower, or they hire some low-rent private investigator to take grainy photos in a parking lot. That isn't how you solve a problem. That is how you create noise. If you want to find the truth, you don't go looking for secrets. You look for the data that the secret keepers forgot to clean up. In my line of work, I never had to hunt for the truth. I just had to wait for the system to tell me where it was hiding. My son, Mark, had installed a top-of-the-line security system in their home. Being a software engineer, he treated his house like a fortress. He had cameras, smart locks, and activity logs that recorded every single entry and exit. To a normal person, this was just about convenience and safety. To me, it was a ledger. I didn't need to snoop through Sarah's private messages because I had the metadata of her life. I didn't access anything I wasn't allowed to see. Mark had given me access to the system months ago as a backup contact in case of an emergency. All I had to do was look at the timestamps. I started running a simple cross-reference. I pulled up the dates Sarah said she was in Chicago for those marketing conferences. Then, I looked at the activity logs for the house. It's funny what you find when you look at the logs objectively. There were days she claimed to be away at a summit, yet the house logs showed her car pulling out of the garage at 6 a.m. and returning at 8 p.m. She hadn't even left town. She was just using the trip as a cover to disappear during the workday. I did the same for Sterling, the boss. I went to the public corporate filings and the event calendars for his company. It wasn't hard to find. A quick search of his speaking engagements matched the exact dates Sarah had gone out of town. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just fitting together. They were locking into place with the cold, satisfying click of a well-engineered machine. I wasn't dealing with a mastermind criminal. I was dealing with two arrogant people who thought they were smarter than the systems they lived within. They were reckless. They were sloppy. They were leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly to their door, and they were so caught up in their own little world that they didn't even notice the audit trail they were leaving behind. Once I had the timeline, I needed to make the play. I didn't want to confront them while they were still in the middle of their game. That would be messy, and I detest mess. I needed to leverage the corporate side of this. I remembered a man I had worked with years ago during a corporate fraud investigation, the chairman of the board of the very company Sterling worked for. We hadn't spoken in years, but in the world of high-stakes consulting, a professional inquiry is always remembered. I sat in my home office, surrounded by the quiet hum of my computer, and made one phone call. I didn't call to gossip. I didn't call to tell tales. I called to ask a professional question about compliance and ethical oversight. I told the chairman, "I've been reviewing some internal reports regarding your regional marketing division, and I've noticed some serious discrepancies regarding expense accounts and unauthorized use of company resources. It looks like a significant liability issue that could blow up in the board's face if it isn't addressed." I didn't even have to name Sterling. I just laid out the facts I had gathered. The travel expenses that didn't match the event logs, the misuse of corporate funds for personal travel. I painted a picture of a structural risk that any board would be terrified of. The chairman, being a man who valued the integrity of his company above all else, thanked me for the heads up and promised to launch an immediate, quiet internal audit. He didn't know he was investigating an affair. He thought he was investigating embezzlement. And in his eyes, both were just as dangerous to his bottom line. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. The trap was set. It wasn't a trap built on anger or vengeance. It was a trap built on policy, procedure, and the inevitable consequences of breaking the rules. I had removed the human element entirely. I had let the system do the work for me. Sterling and Sarah were about to be caught, not because I told on them, but because they had violated the protocols of their own professional lives. They thought they were playing a game of passion. I was playing a game of checkmate. The silence in that cabin was heavy, the kind of stillness that settles before a storm. I stood in the middle of the living room, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I didn't look like a man who had just caught his daughter-in-law in an affair. I looked like a man who had just finished a routine business inspection. Sterling, of course, did not understand the difference. He straightened his tie, puffed out his chest, and tried to summon the corporate authority he used every day to bully his subordinates. He looked at me with a mix of annoyance and dismissal, as if my presence were nothing more than a minor technical glitch in his day. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Sterling asked, his voice dripping with that specific brand of entitlement that comes from years of unchecked power. He stepped forward, trying to loom over me, trying to reclaim the room with his physical presence. "You are trespassing. If you think you can come into my private space, or anyone's space, and start making accusations, you are gravely mistaken. This is an embarrassing misunderstanding, and if you walk out that door right now, maybe we can pretend this never happened." I didn't answer him immediately. I watched him. I studied the way his eyes darted to Sarah, who was cowering behind him, trying to make herself invisible. I watched the nervous tick in his jaw. It was fascinating, really, how quickly the big man facade crumbled when the threat of exposure became real. I walked over to the mahogany coffee table in the center of the room and placed my briefcase down. The click of the latches sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for a manila folder. I didn't pull out a gun or a knife. I pulled out paper. Paper is a much more effective weapon if you know how to use it. "I know exactly who you are, Sterling," I said, my voice steady, conversational, almost polite. I opened the folder and placed it on the table. It was organized. It had tabs. It had dates. It had the metadata from the cabin logs. It had the cross-referenced expense reports from his company. I'm not here to talk about an affair. Affairs are messy, emotional, and frankly, boring. I'm here because I found some discrepancies in the corporate ledger that caught my attention. I'm a forensic accountant. I look for errors. And you, Sterling, have made a great many of them. The color drained from his face. He didn't look at me anymore. He looked at the folder. He knew what it was before he even read the first page. That's the beauty of working with intelligent people. You don't have to explain the implications. They already know. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a sudden, frantic realization of what this meant for his career, his reputation, and his bottom line. He reached out, his hand hovering over the folder, but he didn't touch it. He was afraid that if he touched it, he would be acknowledging that his life as he knew it was over. "You called them," Sarah whispered. Her voice was barely audible, a sharp contrast to the confident, dismissive tone she had used just minutes before. She wasn't looking at Sterling anymore. She was looking at the reality of her own choices. She had spent months playing a dangerous game, thinking she was the one in control, thinking she could manipulate the people around her without consequence. She hadn't realized that the person she was playing against was playing a different game entirely. She was playing for excitement. I was playing for the truth. I watched Sterling's hands start to shake. He tried to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, maybe a bribe or a promise of silence, but no words came out. He knew the chairman. He knew that if that folder reached the board, there would be no negotiation, no private settlement, no pretending this never happened. There would only be an investigation, a swift termination, and a public fallout that he couldn't control. He was a corporate man, and I had just taken away his biggest asset, his plausible deniability. "The audit is already in motion," I said, my voice still as cool as the mountain air outside. "This isn't about your personal life. That's between you and your conscience, or whatever is left of it. This is about professional negligence, fraud, and the misuse of corporate assets. You thought you were hiding in the shadows, Sterling. But shadows are only there because there's a light source. And I've just turned the light on." The reversal was complete. The hunter had become the hunted, not because I had chased him, but because I had simply exposed the trap he had built for himself. He looked at me, not with anger anymore, but with a desperate, pathetic fear. He was waiting for me to tell him what to do. He wanted me to tell him how to fix it, how to bury the evidence, how to make the problem go away. But I was done helping him. I had provided the data. The rest was up to the system. The aftermath was not a dramatic explosion of shouting or violence, because that is not how reality operates. In the professional world, when the truth comes to light, the response is almost always quiet, swift, and entirely clinical. Sterling resigned within 48 hours. The company didn't even wait for the full internal audit to conclude. They saw the preliminary data I had provided, identified the breach of ethics, and decided that he was a liability they could no longer afford. He didn't go out in a blaze of glory. He went out with a signed non-disclosure agreement and a tarnished reputation that would follow him through every future interview, every background check, and every professional circle for the rest of his career. He became a ghost in his own industry. Sarah's situation was different, though equally inevitable. I didn't have to tell Mark what to do next. When I handed him the file, the same one that had terrified Sterling in the living room, I didn't offer my opinion or my anger. I simply placed the data in front of him and let him reach his own conclusions. I watched my son as he sat at the kitchen table, the silence in the room heavy with the weight of realization. He didn't cry. He didn't throw things. He looked at the travel dates, the expense reports, and the logs that contradicted everything he had been told for months. He looked at the evidence of a life being lived behind his back. Mark has always been a man of logic, and logic is a powerful tool when you are facing a betrayal. He saw the pattern. He realized that the person he had married was a stranger who had been masquerading as a partner. The divorce wasn't a shouting match. It was a dissolution of a contract that had been breached. Because we had the documentation, the legal proceedings were swift and brutal. Sarah tried to play the role of the victim, attempting to spin the narrative, but in a court of law, emotion holds very little currency compared to signed documents and timestamps. Her attempts to rewrite the story fell apart under the scrutiny of the truth. She lost the life she had tried to build by tearing down someone else's. I remember sitting on the porch of the cabin a few weeks later. The air was clear, and the mountains looked exactly as they had before all of this began. There was a sense of balance restored, not because I had sought vengeance, but because I had corrected an imbalance in the ledger. People often confuse justice with revenge. They think that revenge is about making someone else suffer, about dragging them down into the mud to get even. That is a waste of energy. Revenge is messy. It is reactive, and it is usually driven by a need for validation. It is an emotional trap that keeps you tethered to the person you are trying to hurt. Justice, however, is not about the other person. Justice is about the system. It is about the objective reality of cause and effect. It is the simple, cold calculation that when an action is taken, there must be a consequence. I didn't destroy Sterling and Sarah. I simply removed the lies that were keeping their artificial reality intact. They destroyed themselves the moment they decided that their desires were more important than the truth. They built their house on a foundation of deception, and all I did was point out that the foundation was failing. Gravity did the rest. Mark is doing better now. He has moved on, refocused his energy on his work and his own well-being. He learned a hard lesson, but he learned it completely. He no longer looks at the world with the same blind trust he once did, which is a tragedy, but it is also a necessity. He understands now that trust is not a default setting. It is a currency that should be spent wisely, and only on those who can prove they are worth the investment. As for me, I am back to my life of observation. I still look at the numbers. I still look at the world around me and check for anomalies. People walk through life, creating all sorts of chaos, telling themselves stories that make their actions seem justifiable or clever. They think no one is watching, or that they are too smart to be caught. They forget that everything leaves a trail. Every choice, every lie, every hidden transaction leaves a mark. And eventually, the ledger has to be balanced. If there is a lesson here, it is this: do not fear the people who shout. Do not fear the people who make threats or try to intimidate you with their status or their volume. They are just making noise. The person you should be afraid of is the one who says nothing, the person who watches, who listens, and who waits for the numbers to stop adding up. In the end, the truth isn't something you fight for with words. The truth is just a matter of fact, and facts, unlike people, never lie. Keep your eyes open, check the details, and always ensure your own side of the ledger is clean, because the audit is always coming, and it never misses a single thing.